The Great Hall at Oxford's Sheldonian Theatre had never felt so charged with anticipation. Students and faculty members filled every available seat, with latecomers standing against the ornate walls, their breath collectively held as they awaited what promised to be the intellectual showdown of the academic year. Richard Dawkins, the silver-haired evolutionary biologist whose name had become synonymous with militant atheism, adjusted his microphone at the podium. Across the stage sat Father Thomas Riley, a Jesuit priest whose credentials in quantum physics were as impressive as his theological training. Between them, moderator Dr. Eleanor Harmon, chair philosophy, glanced at her watch before nodding to the technician to dim the lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Harmon began, her voice carrying across the hushed hall, "welcome to this evening's Oxford Union debate, Faith in an Age of Science. We are honored to host two distinguished thinkers whose perspectives on the existence of God represent the poles of modern discourse." The audience shifted in their seats, some leaning forward with notebooks poised, others crossing their arms defensively, their allegiances already clear. Dawkins was first to speak, rising with the confident air of someone who had won this argument countless times before. His PowerPoint presentation flickered to life on the screen behind him, displaying a timeline of evolutionary history spanning billions of years. "What you see before you," Dawkins began, his voice crisp and assured, "is the true creation story, not written in ancient texts by men who believed the earth was flat, but painstakingly assembled through centuries of scientific inquiry, evidence, and peer review." For the next 20 minutes, Dawkins delivered a masterclass in evolutionary biology, his words precise as scalpels, dissecting religious belief with intellectual fervor. "The God hypothesis," he declared, gesturing emphatically toward a slide showing the mathematical improbability of divine intervention, "has become unnecessary. Science has rendered God obsolete." He clicked to his final slide, which showed a quote from Laplace to Napoleon. "I had no need of that hypothesis." A ripple of appreciative laughter spread through one section of the audience. Throughout this presentation, Father Thomas sat quietly, occasionally nodding, sometimes jotting notes on a small pad. Unlike many religious figures who had faced Dawkins before, he showed no signs of discomfort or defensiveness. If anything, he seemed genuinely interested, his expression thoughtful rather than troubled. When Dawkins concluded to enthusiastic applause from one half of the audience, Father Thomas approached the podium with unhurried steps. He was younger than Dawkins by perhaps 15 years, with prematurely gray hair at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic rather than clerical appearance. He wore a simple black shirt with a clerical collar, the only visible sign of his priesthood. "First," Father Thomas began, his voice carrying a soft Irish lilt, "I want to thank Professor Dawkins for his excellent summary of evolutionary theory. I find myself in agreement with much of what he has shared." This unexpected opening caused a stir of confusion. The priest smiled slightly at the reaction. "Perhaps that surprises some of you. It shouldn't. The Catholic Church has long accepted the evidence for evolution, though we might differ on certain philosophical implications." Father Thomas tapped his own device, and the screen changed to show a series of images: the double helix of DNA, the Hubble Deep Field photograph of distant galaxies, and finally, the complex equations of quantum mechanics. Science has indeed given us profound insights into how our universe operates. And as someone who spent 20 years in theoretical physics before entering the seminary, I revere the scientific method and its achievements. He paused, allowing this statement to sink in. "What you may not know," he continued, meeting Dawkins' gaze directly, "is that I once shared Professor Dawkins' perspective entirely. I was, in fact, an atheist well into my 30s, convinced that science had explained away the need for God." Several students who had been fidgeting now sat perfectly still, their expectations disrupted. Father Thomas stepped slightly away from the podium, as if choosing to speak more personally. "My journey from atheism to faith didn't come through abandoning reason, but through following it to its limits. Working in quantum mechanics, I found myself confronting questions that science could describe but not explain. Why does the universe exist at all? Why does it operate according to comprehensible laws? What gives rise to consciousness? The more fundamental the questions became, the more I realized that science, for all its power, operates within boundaries. He turned to a new slide showing quotes from noted scientists, Einstein, Heisenberg, and Planck, all reflecting on the limitations of scientific knowledge and the mystery that remains beyond it. These aren't religious figures, but scientists acknowledging the horizons of human understanding. Dawkins shifted in his seat, his expression now alert and focused. This was not the Bible-quoting opponent he had anticipated. Father Thomas continued, his voice growing softer, compelling the audience to lean in. But it wasn't theoretical considerations alone that changed my perspective. It was an experience I had while still working at CERN. The priest's eyes seemed to look inward now, remembering. I was asked to visit a colleague's son in hospital. Samuel was 12, dying of leukemia, and fascinated by particle physics. His father thought my visits might distract him from the pain. The hall had grown completely silent. Even those who had come to cheer Dawkins were listening intently. On my final visit, Samuel asked me a question I couldn't answer with equations or theories. He asked if I was afraid of dying. As a committed atheist, I wanted to offer him comfort, but found myself unable to articulate anything meaningful beyond the cessation of neural activity. This bright child, facing his own mortality with extraordinary courage, looked at me with clarity I'll never forget and said, "I'm not afraid. I think consciousness is like light. It can't be created or destroyed, just changed." Father Thomas paused, removing his glasses briefly. He died that night, holding my hand and looking at the stars through his window with a peace I couldn't explain through any materialist framework. There was a shift in the atmosphere of the Great Hall, a softening that was almost tangible. Dawkins himself had uncrossed his arms, his expression more open than combative now. "I'm not sharing this as proof of God's existence," Father Thomas clarified, replacing his glasses. "I'm sharing it to explain that my faith didn't come from ignorance or fear or indoctrination. The usual suspect Professor Dawkins rightly criticizes. It came from reaching the edges of what science could tell me and finding that my deepest human experiences suggested something more. That the universe isn't just matter and energy, but perhaps, as Max Planck suggested, derived from a conscious and intelligent mind." The moderator announced the beginning of the response phase, and all eyes turned to Dawkins. He rose slowly, his demeanor notably different from his opening presentation. "Father Thomas presents his case with eloquence," he began, his voice measured. "But I must point out that personal experience, however moving, does not constitute evidence in the scientific sense." Yet there was a hesitation in his usual rhythm, as if the priest's story had momentarily disrupted his well-rehearsed arguments. "The comfort we seek in the face of mortality does not make supernatural explanations valid." He continued with his critique, but several audience members exchanged glances, noticing the subtle shift in his tone. Less dismissive, more contemplative. When Father Thomas responded, he nodded respectfully. "I agree completely that emotional comfort doesn't make something true. I'm not arguing for God as a psychological crutch. That would be intellectually dishonest. I'm suggesting that consciousness, meaning, and the fundamental nature of reality may exceed purely materialistic explanations." What followed was unlike any debate most attendees had witnessed. Instead of talking past each other, the two men engaged in genuine dialogue. Dawkins challenged the priest on the problem of suffering. Father Thomas acknowledged it as the most profound objection to belief. The priest questioned whether random mutation alone could explain the emergence of consciousness. Dawkins conceded there were still significant gaps in our understanding. A graduate student asked about the multiverse theory, and to everyone's surprise, both men found common ground in criticizing how it was sometimes invoked to avoid deeper questions. It can become as much a matter of faith as any theological proposition, Father Thomas observed, and Dawkins, after a thoughtful pause, reluctantly nodded. As the debate approached its conclusion, Dr. Harmon asked each speaker for final thoughts. Father Thomas spoke of the complementary nature of science and faith when practiced with integrity. Science excels at answering how questions. Religion attempts to address why questions. The conflict arises when either oversteps its proper domain. When Dawkins' turn came, the audience leaned forward expectantly. He stood silent for several seconds, his expression uncharacteristically contemplative. While I maintained my position, he finally said, his voice carrying a new note of nuance. I must acknowledge that Father Thomas approaches these questions with an intellectual rigor I respect. The admission sent whispers through the crowd. Though we disagree on fundamental conclusions, there is value in acknowledging the boundaries of certainty on both sides. After the formal debate concluded, something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual rush for exits, the audience remained seated, watching as Dawkins and Father Thomas continued their conversation privately at the edge of the stage. Their body language was relaxed, animated with genuine intellectual engagement rather than posturing. A physics student near the front captured a photograph that would later go viral. The world's most famous atheist and the priest-physicist leaning toward each other in conversation, both smiling with unexpected warmth. Outside the hall, students gathered in small groups, their discussions spilling into nearby pubs and dormitory common rooms. I came expecting a slaughter, said one biology major, but I witnessed something far more valuable: actual dialogue. A theology student nodded. For once it wasn't about winning, but understanding. In the weeks that followed, recordings of the debate circulated widely across campus and eventually online. Journalists who had come expecting sensational headlines instead wrote thoughtful pieces about the rare civility displayed between two opposing worldviews. The Oxford student newspaper ran an editorial titled, "When Titans Listen, a Model for Public Discourse." 3 months later, Dawkins and Father Thomas appeared together on a popular podcast. While neither had changed their fundamental positions, both spoke of how the encounter had refined their thinking. The strongest arguments deserve the most careful attention, Dawkins remarked, regardless of whether they come from unexpected sources. Father Thomas was invited to lecture at several prestigious universities previously hesitant to host religious speakers. His talks consistently drew diverse audiences of believers, skeptics, and the genuinely curious. The most lasting impact, however, was felt by those who had witnessed the original debate. Many reported that it had changed not what they believed, but how they engaged with those who disagreed with them. A student who had been recording the debate for a philosophy blog later wrote, "In an age of polarization, I witnessed two intellectual opponents demonstrate that rivalry need not mean enmity, and that certainty need not exclude humility." A year after the debate, Oxford hosted a follow-up symposium on boundaries of knowledge, featuring scientists, philosophers, and theologians from across the ideological spectrum. In his opening remarks, the university chancellor noted that the event owed its existence to a moment when two adversaries chose understanding over victory. As for Dawkins and Father Thomas, they maintained a correspondence that both described as vigorously challenging and unexpectedly rewarding. Their exchange of letters was eventually published under the title, "Across the Divide," a dialogue on science, faith, and the limits of knowledge, becoming required reading in courses on philosophy of science at universities worldwide. This story reminds us that true wisdom isn't about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions with humility. The most powerful moments of human connection often come not when we convince others we are right, but when we demonstrate that we are listening. If this message touched you, share it with someone who needs it today. In a world increasingly defined by echo chambers and tribal certainties, perhaps the most radical act is to engage thoughtfully with those whose worldviews challenge our own.